Hi, and welcome back to part two of Reference Checking Isn't a Waste of Time. You're just doing it wrong. Again, I'm Greg Moran, CEO of Check.com. Spent part one of this webinar really talking about and trying to debunk why reference checking, the common thought of why reference checking isn't a waste of time. But now we want to discuss a new model of reference checking and really how to do it for maximum result. So in this new model of reference checking, the best way to really start is a comparison of the old versus new model. So let's really start by looking at the two. Well, first, when we look at the new model of reference check, we want to look to the web for help on this one. The unstructured, open-ended, unplanned reference checks of the past with little tie to the job are not really cutting it. Here's a trivia question for you. Why do we ask 3 references? The best answer I can come up with is because the applications I bought at Staples a few years ago had 3 spots. It's just the way it's always been done. The new model, though, is web-based to make it easier on the candidate, the hiring manager, and most of all, the reference provider. And then when led by the candidate, instead of the hiring manager or HR, and conducted over the web, we see completion rates really start to soar. Now, with our system specifically, just as an example, checked reference, the actual reference request is system generated and it comes from the candidate, not the hiring manager or human resources. So remember the issue about the provider from part 1 we talked about, the provider not wanting to answer questions from someone they don't know about, someone with whom they do have a relationship? Well, this flips that dynamic on its head. And as for completion rates, give the reference provider a chance for anonymous feedback, and the completion rates climb again, usually in the 80+% range. And lastly, base these reference checks on a position benchmark to really ensure job relevance. We talked about this in part 1 too, and to really get maximum legal protection. And then ask questions resulting from that benchmark in a structured assessment-based format to ensure greater objectivity and candor on the part of the reference and really increase the quality of that reference check. We'll show you an example later. Then tie it into the remainder of the screening process. So when we're thinking about these new models, I wanted to give you 10 things to really consider. First, structured versus job-relevant questionnaire. This is huge. Making sure that you're really asking questions that relate to that job, not that sort of generic conversation that the traditional phone-based reference check usually has, the superficial conversation. 2, contextual versus tactical questions. Again, if you didn't see part 1, go back and take a look at this. We talked about contextual questions. Getting to the why behind performance. You know, not asking questions like, does Vince consistently reach quota, but really asking questions like, versus your average sales rep, what level of recognition or teamwork or things like that we really want to understand why somebody performs like they do. 3, ask a minimum of 5 references. Again, get past that old 3 model. Get, the more the better. And again, if you're using an online reference check tool, this becomes a lot easier. 4, candidate-driven versus an HR-driven process. Let the candidate do the inviting or arrange the conversations if you're not using an online tool. If you are using an online tool, it makes it really easy. 5, score the answers based on a consistent scale. If you're asking structured questions, you can easily score those answers and really give you a more objective manner to really evaluate this. 6, integrate it into other screening tools. We mentioned this before, but here's an idea for you as an example. If you're using a behavioral assessment, if you're not, definitely you should be. But if you're using a behavioral assessment, you're using it up front in the screening process, which hopefully you are, then go ahead and look for the disconnects from the benchmark between this candidate and that underlying benchmark from behavioral assessment, and then put some structured reference questions together relating to that. And that's really kind of tying it into other parts of the screening process. 7, the reality is references equal talent pipeline. It's the oldest rule, oldest axiom in the executive search world, and something you should be looking at. The more references you're asking for, continue to build that talent pipeline. 8, anonymity really helps completion rates. Again, this one's only really generally possible with online reference checking, but it really does help the process when the reference provider can be free from that moral dilemma we talked about in section 1. 9, optimize the process through manager feedback and performance data, really going back and as you're putting a process like this in, going back and seeing what areas of it are predicting well and what areas of it aren't predicting well by actually collecting performance data on your new hires made using this system. And then obviously consider an online reference checking system to really help you minimize the cost and maximize the quality. If you're not familiar with online reference checking, here are a couple things about it. First, it's fast. Real-time completion and reporting. You don't have to spend the time picking up the phone, having the voicemail tag and everything else associated. You just send the invite to the candidate, you're done. as a hiring manager. It's cheap, real low cost per candidate, especially when you start to consider that to the time wasted in traditional reference checking, but a really low cost per candidate typically, but very measurable. So again, because you're getting the data in, it's a structured more like a behavioral assessment taken by the references. You can really measure that ROI pretty clearly. It's also anonymous. You're looking at an aggregated reference report for the most part. So again, quality, candor, objectivity on the part of the reference goes up significantly. It's structured. These are closed, scored questions. These are assessment-type questions. And it's also job relevant based on an underlying position benchmark, functioning in much the same way that you would expect to see a pre-employment test or behavioral assessment. So let me give you an example. And this is actually, it comes from our own product, Checked Reference. Here's a really brief example of just what it looks like. So as we discussed the importance of job relevance in the benchmark, you notice along the left the competencies associated with this position. And again, giving candidate scores. We talked about scoring, 1 to 5. This represents part of the benchmark, those competencies. Here's your scoring so you can actually get a sense of how this candidate performed, how the references rated this candidate. This screen looks a little funny. This is not an actual screen lifted straight out of the reference check, out of checked reference, but what it does tell you is show you some of the functionality. So from this data that we saw on the last screen comes a set of reports like an executive summary, structured interview questions to help with further screening. Again, a good example of the integrated approach that we discussed before. And lastly, here's an example of how it all ties together and how the manager feedback can really help optimize the process. The blue triangles represent the reference providers and how they score the candidate on the various competencies. That green bar represents the benchmark. The orange triangles represents how the candidate completed their own self-assessment. So again, another example of the tie-in. This is a tie-in to the behavioral assessment. And then the green triangles, you got to fast forward the chronology here, but the green triangles represent after a sufficient period of time has elapsed, and the hiring manager goes back and they take a version of this assessment about the candidate, or about now their new hire, to really show how well is the system predicting. And then you can go back and optimize it if it's not predicting as well as you'd like it to be. This all happens, though, in real time. It takes the candidate less than 5 minutes to complete, and it generally takes the reference provider less than 3 minutes simply by clicking on an email and a link. So that was a real fast version of sort of what online reference checking is all about, the new model of reference checking. If you're watching this online, the Q&A is available online for you to download and review. And before you do that, if you want further information on Check.com or Checked Reference, the product we saw, or any of our employee screening products, by all means, please go to check.com/demo-request and go ahead and put in a request. And we'd love to spend some time talking about your specific needs and how how Checked may be able to deliver value in your screening process. Thanks. Have a great day, and we look forward to talking to you soon.